Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to The Drill Down. When most people think about money and food, they think about the cost of food. They think about inflation. Today, we're going to talk about the cost of the food you eat and the health effects that it might have. And we're going to talk about the big money in the food industry. The host of this program, of course, is Eric Eggers. Eric, you on any crazy, unusual diets these days?
Yeah, I'm on a lobbying-only diet. So I'm only eating foods that people who are actively lobbying the RFK Senate confirmation process are responsible for. So it's basically you can eat anything, and I am.
Well, we're very fortunate. We actually have a guest who's an expert in this subject. We are not. We're interested in the money and politics aspect of it we're going to get to. But we have Vani Hari with us. She is the Food Babe. That's the website that she runs. She's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers. We highly recommend those books. And what I love about her approach is it's about transparency. It's about getting people engaged with the process. And she works with some pretty powerful companies like Chick-fil-A and others, Kraft Foods, to actually try to get them to change their products to make them healthier.
Yeah, I love when we can talk to people who kind of do what we do. And that is to say, we look at a problem that exists in this country and we say, everyone gets that this is a problem. How come it's not getting better?
Yeah.
And if it's not getting better, it's because there are powerful people or corporations who are making money off of the status quo. And while we try to report on that and talk about the money behind it, Vani's been actively engaged in trying to help force some changes. And I think may be partly responsible for one of the changes that the FDA announced just a couple of weeks ago, which is the elimination of one of those food dyes. So
yeah,
it's very exciting to have this conversation. It's very relevant. You don't often think about money and food this way, but the stuff that we do put in our body matters in lots of different ways, and there's a lot of people spending a lot of money trying to actively influence it right now.
Yeah, well, first of all, Vani, welcome to the program, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your story. In what I've read, you were a management consultant, but you had a health scare when you were younger, which led you to use your analytical and research skills to explore food and diet nutrition. Tell us about your story as it relates to the scare and how you got interested in this in the first place.
Sure. I had 2 immigrant Indian parents that came here from India. And when my dad married my mom in an arranged marriage, the first thing he introduced her to when he got to America was a McDonald's hamburger. He said, if we're going to live in America, we're going to eat like Americans. And that's how I was raised, on processed food. And I mean, they thought it was amazing that we had food so readily available, very cheap. I was always coloring the free coloring page on Mother's Day and Father's Day to get the free breakfast at McDonald's. I was there, at the grocery store looking for all the things that the people around me were eating on Thanksgiving that my mom didn't know how to cook, and she didn't have the long, the different handed down recipes. So she relied on the stovetop stuffing and the Pepperidge Farm and the cranberry sauce in the can for Thanksgiving. So we relied on the American processed food system to basically for our entire diet as a child. And, even though my mom went back to cooking homemade Indian food for her and my dad, I kind of shunned that because now it's my favorite. But back then I shunned it because it was so different than what everybody else was eating. And I just wanted to fit in. We were one of the only Indian families in Charlotte, North Carolina at the time. And it was just one of those moments of like, okay, how do I find my footing? So I, again, just kind of found myself in this situation where I was in and out of doctors' offices as a result of the way I was eating. However, no doctor asked me what I was eating. They literally just put me on 4 different medications to control my asthma, 3 different medications to control my eczema, antibiotics and prednisone anytime things gotten out of control every season. So it was a cycle of just in and out of doctor's offices on lots of prescription drugs. And then in my early 20s, where I got a job working for a big consulting firm, working for the financial institutions of America, I was put on the road with this very lavish lifestyle. I was on an expense account. I was right out of college. It was so much fun. I was eating these 5-course meals at, at the time, Ruth's Chris was actually super fancy. Now I don't think it's so fancy anymore. But anyway, so, and I'd never, had that kind of lifestyle before. So it was really exciting. And then they brought in breakfast, lunch, and dinner so that you could bill more hours to the client. And I saw myself slowly gaining weight, like actually kind of rapidly, and then started to feel really bad about myself. And then I ended up with a pain in my side that took me to the hospital. The emergency room doctor told me to go home. There was nothing wrong. thankfully, my parents had a sixth sense and said, you need to go see your regular doctor in the morning. Something doesn't seem right. And that's when I found out my appendix was about to burst and I had an emergency appendectomy. And when I was recovering in that hospital bed in my early 20s, and everybody else that were my friends and people that I wanted to hang out with, they were going out having fun. It was Christmas time, I remember, and they were going to parties. And I was sitting in this hospital room with a cut down my side, an organ taken out of my body. And I said, enough's enough. Something doesn't seem right. And the first thing I actually researched was appendicitis. How do you get appendicitis? All the doctors told me that you don't need your appendix. It's an organ that you don't need anymore. Why did God put it in you? I don't know. Like, basically, it's going to be fine. You're going to get through this. They didn't tell me that the reason my appendix was about to burst is because my body was inflamed. My digestive system was inflamed with the things that I was eating. And when I started to research using these skills that I learned in high school, where I was a top tier debater, went to Dartmouth debate camp every summer. I got recruited to college to be in debate. And I used those skills towards my health. And I started to check out these big books from the library on nutrition. And one of the books that I checked out had this concept inside that just hit me on the head. And it was that the majority of foods on the grocery store shelves that are packaged and processed are dead. And that's actually how I felt for most of my life. Dead, zombie-like.
Yeah, and you can imagine that not only are those products dead, but they're also quite profitable for the companies. And there's a reason why that happens. It's not like the companies just decide, let's make stuff that's unhealthy and will inflame digestive systems, but it's a process. And and what I love about the work that you've done is you try to hold companies accountable. A company like Kellogg's, for example, said in 2015, hey, we're going to take these artificial dyes out of our foods. And then somehow, some way, after the press release went away, the public attention did as well. And I guess they neglected, maybe they forgot, Vani. I'm not sure what you think happened to Kellogg's, but you've tried to put some additional pressure on them. I guess, is Kellogg's unique that way, or is this a widespread problem? And we focus on government accountability and the influence of money in politics and the corruption aspect of it. How much of a threat do you feel like the nomination of RFK Jr., who just today passed his one round of Senate confirmation hearings, poses to this status quo of companies putting and creating dead food for the American people?
Yeah, I mean, he's a major threat to big pharma, big ag, big food, because he's going to dismantle the corruption that has allowed our country to be the worst in terms of health outcomes, even though we spend the most on healthcare. When I started to figure out this information about the food that I was eating, I got so upset. I felt duped that the majority of foods that I was eating was healthier. I thought America had the best food because America first, right? Like, we are the most profitable nation, so we obviously have the best. And I found out that I was actually being hoodwinked. I was being duped by the American food supply. And the first, I would say, major investigation I did when I eventually quit my job to do Food Babe full time was this investigation in comparing American products, the same exact American products we have here in the United States, to the same products that they sell in other countries, and comparing the ingredient lists. And I was horrified when I saw the differences in ingredients. I remember one of the first products was Quaker Oats strawberry oatmeal, where here in the United States, it was artificially dyed bits of apple that were with Red 40, a petroleum-based dye linked to hyperactivity in children. But in Europe, they were using real strawberries in their Quaker Oats. I mean, it was absolutely insane. And so I did this investigation. It went viral, and I decided to do something about it. And so the first company I took on was Kraft. Kraft was selling a version of mac and cheese without artificial food dyes in Europe, but was using paprika and beta carotene in Europe. But here in the United States, they're using yellow 5 and yellow 6. And the reason they removed the artificial food dyes in Europe is not because of some nice thing they did just for Europeans. The Europeans started using a cigarette type warning label on their products that had an artificial food dye. And so they knew that their product caused harm to children. And so what they did, instead of using instead of putting that warning label on their product, they removed the dyes for Europe, but decided to keep them the same in the United States. I just want to know, why wouldn't they do it for all their customers, right? And so I decided to take them on. I got 386,000 signatures on a petition, took those to Kraft headquarters. They told me to go away, basically, but they did meet with me that day. And eventually we changed the marketplace. We took all of their customers, most of their customers, and shifted them over to Annie's, their competitor. And then Annie's got bought up by General Mills for $800 million shortly thereafter. And then at that point is when they decided, okay, yeah, enough's enough. We're losing enough customer base that we're going to make the change. And they made the announcement. But this is how you change the food industry, and actually how I was able to change the food industry faster than the government, because for so long, our government agencies have been captured by industry and this paid for lobbyists for example, Red 3. Let's just take that. That just got banned, and it took over 30 years to get that done. But when they decided to ban it 30 years ago in cosmetics, the maraschino cherry lobby, which worked. There is a maraschino cherry lobby. I mean, can you believe that? The maraschino cherry lobby actually worked with the powers of the alcohol industry. So yes, very big industry, right? And they said that removing those little cherries from drinks at the bar would hurt alcohol sales. So they convinced the regulatory bodies to keep it in food. And then that allowed other food manufacturers that make bacon bits and children's candy and all sorts of medicines and all kinds of things to continue to use it. And that is unacceptable. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of the corruption that has existed in the FDA and that has prevented common sense legislation from happening, especially when the science shows that there's harm.
Well, and I think that's what's so powerful about your approach, right, is that you use transparency, use public pressure, and you show corporations this is actually in your public interest. When people find out about this, they don't want to use your products anymore. So I want to ask you a question about RFK Jr. and about the role of government in this, right? Because this is an issue I think that is controversial. What I like about RFK's approach when he was testifying, he just says, look, if you want to go and have a McDonald's burger, go ahead and have a McDonald's burger. We're not going to take that away. We're not going to be a nanny state. On the other hand, we're going to put out information and to help people make more informed decisions. And if there are actually very harmful ingredients, we're going to deal with those. But talk about, where do you draw the line? How do you inform and empower people to make healthy decisions? And how do you prevent it from becoming the nanny state? Because the same government that was telling people you were required to have these vaccines, we don't necessarily want that same government, saying you're not allowed to have this burger or you're not allowed to have that product. So how do you draw that line?
Yeah, it's never been about actually taking away anybody's food. It's about, first of all, making it the safest it can be, and especially when these food companies are already making these same products overseas with better, safer ingredients. I mean, this runs the gamut, not only that we mentioned Kraft and Kellogg's, but this is also McDonald's, this is Pizza Hut, this is, just Subway, this is every single major fast food chain. And then you have all of the major food companies, Kraft, General Mills, PepsiCo. I think of Doritos. The Doritos in Europe don't have artificial food dyes, or MSG. Here in the United States, it does. I'm thinking about Mars, that makes all the candies for children. They don't use artificial food dyes. In Europe, they don't even use titanium dioxide, which is an ingredient that harms your DNA. But they do here, and so first of all, it's the common sense, situation where we need to look at how these chemicals have been approved for use in America, and closing the loophole that allows food companies to approve them themselves, which is what's happening right now. There's no third-party oversight by the FDA on these chemicals. People think there is, but there's not. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that we want to make sure people know the truth about what they're eating, right? That ultra-processed foods are the root cause of chronic disease. And right now, that information is getting buried by special interests, right? We don't know that 38% of preteens are pre-diabetic because that is getting buried, right? We need to be sounding the alarms that we can reverse these, and these are reversible diseases by looking at root cause analysis in terms of what we're eating. And to that case, putting a warning label on an artificial dye product here in America would do more for people than you recognize. First of all, it would inform the parent who is putting their kids on ADHD medication, right? That 15% of children are on ADHD medication or some kind of attention disorder medication. That is unacceptable, right? It would inform them that, hey, what if I look at my lifestyle choices and what I'm eating and what products I'm buying at the grocery store? Maybe if I remove artificial food dyes, I can take my kids off these medications and they will start to feel better and act better in school. So not only will it do that, but the other thing it does is it puts pressure on the food industry to reformulate, just like it did in Europe, because the food industry doesn't want these warning labels on their product. So it will automatically fix the market. And so that's one way to address it. The other way to address it is just to ban those artificial dyes, because honestly, they're made from petroleum. The way they're produced, they produce carcinogens. They have all these problematic issues in children, as well as in adults, eczema, asthma, immune disorders. So this is something, and not to mention, I mean, this was so crazy. They're finding out so much more new science, which the FDA has not reviewed. They just admitted they haven't reviewed safety data on Red 40, for example, in over 10 years. Yellow number 6, just found out, the Wall Street Journal just reported that yellow number 6 turns the skin of mice transparent. Like, why are we putting a product like that in our bodies? Like, what's going on here, right? So,
well, it's because Cheetos are delicious. I mean, that's why. So, I mean, you've answered your own question. But
fingers, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, but I think Peter. I mean, because Peter and I had this conversation before we got to talk to you, and he referenced in another Wall Street Journal editorial that talked about New York City and how Mike Bloomberg tried to ban the Diet Coke and the sugary drinks and all these things, and the conclusion was New York City is actually more obese and less healthy than it is today. But do you find what she's saying about it's not about taking choices away, but this isn't just food. These are chemicals. These are petroleum-based products that these food companies are deciding on their own to serve to the American people. So if nothing else, like the role of government should be to at least inform.
What I love about this approach is it goes on the assumption that people actually can make intelligent decisions. I mean, these are the people that are electing our leaders, so they can make good decisions about what they're eating, how much they're eating, if they have the correct information. And a lot of times they don't have the correct information, and there may be certain things, dyes and whatnot that need to be banned. I don't have expertise in that area, but the larger question, providing them with information. I know that I eat healthier now than I did before for this precise reason.
Well, think about this, and Vani knows this as well as anybody, but you mentioned the idea of cigarette warning labels in Europe, and obviously we've seen this cigarette warning labels, and you mentioned Kraft specifically. So Kraft is one of the companies that in the 1980s, tobacco companies like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds acquired. They acquired Kraft, they acquired General Foods, and they acquired Nabisco. If you want to know why, one of the reasons why we have this obesity epidemic in this country, and when we talk about an epidemic, it's gotten so much worse in the last 10 years. The prevalence of obesity has gone actually in the last 20 years from 30% to now it's 41%. There's 23 states where more than 1/3 of the population is obese. It didn't used to be that high at all 10 years ago. So it's bad, right? And part of the reason is these tobacco companies, they buy up all these food companies and they bring with them this portfolio of flavors and chemicals and dyes, and they start to infuse the foods to make them reach what they call this bliss point, which makes them what I think hyper palatable. And so they made and there's been studies that show that the tobacco company foods were way more addictive as compared to the non-tobacco company foods. And then 20 years later, when the tobacco companies sold their food companies, all the other food companies were like, oh, we can do that too. And so they did. So I guess, like, Vani, how big of a role do you feel like tobacco company and their chemical process has played a role in the chemicals that we now see in food today?
Yeah, and I think it's this really interesting component, and you'll see it on different labels as natural flavor or artificial flavor. It's one of the reasons why when I started my company, Truvani, we decided not to use these chemicals, because what it does is it tricks your brain into remembering a flavor and creating that addictive response in your brain. And the tobacco companies knew this because they were basically flavoring companies where they figured out how to, when somebody put a cigarette on their lips, to continue doing, that motion so they sell more cigarettes, right? The same thing goes for food. I mean, flavoring is used as a mechanism to literally take over your entire olfactory system of your brain. Like, people don't know that when you open up, for example, something out of the freezer, like an ice cream sandwich, they're adding flavoring into that component because when things are frozen, it kind of dulls the senses. And so when you're opening that package, that flavoring component's coming out and you're smelling that product. And so it just, again, increases your salivation, increases your taste bud response. And this is one of the reasons why PepsiCo has a robot that they use in testing that mimics human taste buds. How is the American public supposed to stand a chance against robots that are literally engineering our food to be addictive, right? How do we stand a chance? And this is actually what's happening. What's so interesting that's happening to address this is there is a teenager in Pennsylvania that's suing 11 of the top food companies right now and trying to prove that the reason why he has diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is because of the addictive nature of processed food.
Well, we'll have to track that case. We've been talking to Vani Hari. She runs the Food Babe. She's got her own food product line, which I would encourage people to check out. She's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers. My final question for you, Vani, is so it looks like RFK Jr. is going to be the new Secretary of HHS. Would you consider joining the administration to sort of carry on the cause within government corridors?
I think my position and my power lies with the people on the outside. I represent the moms out there, the everyday citizens, the people that want to see the government change. And I think I can hold everyone more accountable from the outside. So. Yeah.
Well, you'd be in good company. We actually had a gentleman on the podcast last summer who is now the acting director of the DEA. So this is the pipeline. You come on the drill down, and then you go and you run stuff in the government. So just don't rule it out. My last question, Vani, is the fact that you got the lobbyists that have started meeting with RFK, and within weeks we see RFK gets nominated, then we see pictures of him meeting with lobbyists that represent companies like Kellogg's, and there's been Lee Fang articles where they're having conversations about the ways to try to dilute his agenda and if he passes, maybe he'll pass because there's been promises that have been kind of assurances that have been given. We have some experience with this. We did a television special once where we tried to expose SNAP, like the EBT, the food stamp program, and how much they subsidize foods that are just so unhealthy for Americans, including sodas. And, this is before we knew about this Pepsi robot, which I immediately want to know more about, and I'd like to see pictures of it if it exists. But, and then we had a soda lobbyist reach out to us and try to kick us off the show and just try to eliminate the whole deal. I guess the question is that which lobby do you feel like is the most threatened, and which lobby do you feel like is going to give the most pushback based on what you understand to be the priorities of the new HHS under RFK to be?
I mean, when it comes to, for example, one of the things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said that he wanted to tackle first thing was the dye issue, is to get dyes, regulated or banned. And so this is something, or ask the food companies actually to remove them. And I think maybe just him asking, it might work. But I think that there is a fundamental pushback likely from PepsiCo and Coca-Cola. PepsiCo, for just take, for example, Doritos. It's a $5 billion industry, just Doritos itself, right? Which is just insane to think about, right? And so
billion with a B.
With a B, yeah. So you can only imagine how much artificial food dye is involved with making those Doritos and what they would have to do to change the supply chain and get the right natural colorings in and do all of that work. It's going to take years, I'm sure, to make that happen. And so I see that there is going to be there's going to be a lot of resistance from major food corporations like that. But what I see pushing it even faster is the states. We have over 30 states right now looking to ban artificial food dyes in schools or in the state itself, right? Just like California just passed unanimously. All Democrats, all Republicans. It's a super bipartisan issue. Just yesterday, Virginia passed 40-0 in the Senate. I mean, it's absolutely incredible what's happening on the state level. And if enough states do that, they're going to shift consumer preferences and the momentum of this movement in terms of artificial food dyes in a way that the federal government they're going to have to address it from just a 50-state perspective. And it's going to be an opportunity to really bring those stakeholders, at the table and convince them, it's time to do this. That's why I think putting warning labels on would make the industry move faster, because ingredient labels are quick to change. You can do that in 6 months, right? And so if you were to enact that, then the company itself would feel a lot of pressure to avoid that warning label, and they would move faster than what the regulatory timeframe would be like for a ban on dyes. So,
well, we have been talking with a great guest, Vani Hari. She runs the Food Babe, which is a website that you want to check out. She's got True Vani, which is her line of organic foods. We encourage people to check that out. And of course, she's a very prolific author with 4 New York Times bestsellers. So we appreciate you joining us. This is an important conversation we want to stay on top of. Eric, any final thoughts?
Well, whether or not RFK gets nominated, just based on what Vani just said, it reminds me very much, if there's this kind of grassroots movement to get rid of dyes in schools or in states, period. Notice a lot of schools are getting rid of phones as well. And so it sounds like, from our kids' perspective, those are 2 things that are making America healthier again without anybody signing anything into law, which is very encouraging. Yeah,
and as Vani pointed out, these are bipartisan issues now. I think that's the thing that's so exciting. Donald Trump, in a lot of ways, people accuse him of being divisive, but you've got Donald Trump, a conservative Republican president, and you've got RFK Jr., who I think is probably a Democrat, left of center, and they're working in common cause in this same area.
And Gavin Newsom agrees.
Yeah, exactly. So it is a remarkable time. Thank you, Vani, for joining us, and we thank you to the audience for tuning in. We appreciate you paying attention to our research. You can go to thedrilldown.com to see the kind of research that we do, and of course, you can subscribe to this podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Thanks again. Until next time.